Assalamu alaikum. We will begin with lecture 15 today. In the last lecture, I looked at part of the poem Ode to a Nightingale with you. We discussed the first three stanzas, and today I'm going to finish the rest of the poem and discuss the poem in detail with you also. Let's just recap what we did in the previous lecture. In the previous lecture, we discussed how nightingale is a bird, but it is a symbol for a poet. It is a symbol of so many things for the poet. It is a symbol of the youthful love. It is a symbol of beauty for the poet. It is a symbol of immortality for the poet. It is a symbol of everlasting youth, everlasting love, everlasting beauty for the poet. And the same themes that he explored in his other ode on a Grecian urn, he tries to explore them here also, but in a slightly different manner. You saw that when he was discussing these themes in Ode on a Grecian Urn, he was completely lost in the world of the urn. And here also, he gets lost. He wants to get lost into the world of the nightingale. But we see that in the first few stanzas, he's seeking the aid of different things to take him to the world of the nightingale. So we saw that in the first stanza, he's talking about hemlock. He's talking about the wine that Socrates took and that took him away from this world of pain and misery and took him to that everlasting abode. And he speaks of the other forms of wine, the strong wines that is cooled and stored for a long time in the southern part of France, and which smells and tastes of all the flowers and plantation of France. So he is seeking aid of different things in order to escape into the world. But he's at the same time also describing to you the effects of these different things on man's senses and emotions. Because he, as he tells you in the first two lines, that his senses become numb and his heart aches. He compares those feelings with the feelings that he has as he's listening to the song of the nightingale. And naturally for the poet, the song of the nightingale has a far more greater effect on his emotions and on his senses than any of these things. Than even what the river of forgetfulness in Hades can cause him. So the song of the nightingale has a power, has a greater power to alleviate the sufferings, to alleviate the pain, to make his senses numb, to make him let go of the present, to make him forget his present surroundings, to make him forget his present situation, and to take him into that dreamy abode, into that world of imagination, where he can feel light, where he can feel relaxed, where he can be peaceful, where he can be at ease, and where everything is forever. It is everlasting, it is immortal. So this was how he described his feelings in the first two stanzas. In the third stanza, we saw him comparing his comparing himself, his feeling of elation at when he hears a song of the bird, to his the worldly feelings of misery and pain. He tells us how everything here in this world is short-lived. He talks about love, he talks about youth, and he talks about beauty, the same themes that he touches upon in Ode on a Grecian Urn. He talks about them here also, and he talks about how short-lived they are, how limited they are, and how they are, the love here is temporary, it is transient, unlike love in the imaginary world, or beauty in the imaginary world, or youth in the imaginary world, which never dies, which is immortal. So this is how he's comparing the imaginary world to the materialistic real world. We shall start with the poem from stanza 4 in this lecture. So let us look at stanza 4 and let's see how Keats takes you on from these discussions and explanations that he has offered, and makes you and takes you, in fact, to the world of the nightingale. You enter the world of the nightingale with him, and you feel as if you are moving with the poet in the world of the nightingale. So he's going to employ all senses. He's going to use his senses of hearing, his senses of smell, and you can feel that you are with him as he moves along in that world. So in stanza 4, he starts by saying, "Away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his parts, but on the viewless wings of poesy, though the dull brain perplexes and retards." Away, away. You see the longing? He's longing to be away from this world. He wants to be in the world of the nightingale. He says, "I will fly to thee. I will fly to thee." He wants to be part of the bird of the nightingale. Remember, I told you that he cannot see the bird. The bird was hidden from his view. And I explained to you when I was explaining this bird to you when we discussed The Solitary Reaper by Wordsworth, that it is called nightingale because it is a bird which can sing in the night also. You can hear its voices in the early dawn when it is half night and half day. So this is why it is called nightingale. It sings, sometimes you hear it singing in the nightingale. So the bird is invisible most of the time. Even at daytime when you hear its song, it is singing from the thickets of the bushes. So itself is not visible, but it is a song that holds him entranced. So he's imagining, and he says, "I will fly to thee." He says, "I will come to you, I will go to you, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards." Now Bacchus is a god of wine, and pards are his friends. So he says, "I will not fly to you in the chariot which is driven by Bacchus and his friends." Now this god of wine drives his chariot, his carriage, and which flies. It's a flying chariot. So he says, "No, I will not use the help of wine. I will not use the god of wine and his chariot to reach to you." So he discards that option. He does not need the help of wine to elevate him into that feeling, or to take him to that imaginary world. He says, "I don't need wine, but on the viewless wings of poesy." So but what does he say that he needs to get to the world of nightingale? He says, "I need the wings of poesy, the viewless, which cannot be seen, which can only be felt." He says, my verses, my poetry, my composition, this will take me to the world of nightingale, though the dull brain perplexes and retards. He says, although now he still feels that he's under the effect of the song, and the song has had the same effect on him as any strong wine or the river in Hades or the hemlock. So he feels his senses becoming numb and retard, and his emotions becoming dead. So he feels that dull sensation taking hold of him, just as one feels when under the effect of a strong wine or a drug. He says, it's not due to the hemlock, it's not due to the river of forgetfulness, but he says, my words, or the song of the nightingale, which inspires my poetry, which inspires these words, this will take me to the world of nightingale. Then he says, already with thee, already with thee. Now he's jubilant, he's happy. He says, I am with you, O nightingale. Tender is the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry face. He's happy to be with the bird. He says, but he describes to you the scene. He takes you into the thick of the night. He tells you that it is night time, but he says this night is tender, it is peaceful, it is soft. And happily the queen moon is on her throne. Even the moon is personified as a queen, as a beautiful queen sitting on her throne in all her full glory, surrounded by her starry face, by her attendants. So the moon is also beautifully personified. The moon is the queen of the sky, and it is surrounded by all these attendants, which are her stars. He says the moon is shining brightly in the sky, and it is this peaceful time of the night. But here there is no light. Say what from heaven is with the breezes blown through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. He says, but here there is no light. Now he's talking about the world of the nightingale. He's talking about those thickets and bushes and dense forest that he is in. He has gone in search of the nightingale. Remember, he's gone to the world of the nightingale, and the world of the nightingale is hidden from the view. Common eye is hidden from the common eye. He cannot see the bird. He cannot see where it is. So it is hidden. So and it is so thickly hidden and surrounded by thick trees and bushes and leaves that not even the light of the moon can penetrate into that darkness or into the world of the nightingale. He says there is no light here, it's all darkness. But as Keats is going to tell you, even this darkness does not hurt him. Even this darkness is not bad. Even this darkness is not painful. Say what from heaven is with the breezes blown through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. Verdurous glooms is again the thickness of the thick forests, which cause this gloom or the darkness. So this home of nightingale is a magical place which is in the thick of the forest, which is in the thickest part of the forest. And he says no light can enter here, no moonlight can enter here, only at intervals, maybe when the breeze blows the leaves and the branches of the trees, then somewhat a little light can flicker through. But he says otherwise there is dense darkness. Now, stanza 5. In stanza 5 he says, I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet wherewith the seasonable month endows the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild. Now in this stanza he employs his senses. He uses his senses to move through the world of the nightingale. He is still in darkness, and the darkness is so intense that he cannot see around. He cannot see what is around him. He cannot see even his own hands and legs. The darkness is so profuse, so thick, and he can't even see what is at his feet. So because he cannot see, this sense of sight is not working. So he's going to use his other senses to understand the world of nightingale and to explain it to us, explain it to you. So first he's going to employ the sense of, as you shall see, the sense of smell. He uses a sense of smell here in these lines. He says, I can't see what flowers are at my feet. Because it is so dark, he cannot see the plantation, the flowers, the vegetation that is in that part of the forest. He says, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs. Soft incense is a sweet smell. He says, I don't know what flowers are hanging on the boughs. Boughs are the branches. I can't see the flowers which are blooming on the branches around me. But he says he can smell their soft perfume. But in embalmed darkness, you see, I told you, the darkness is not painful for him. It is not scary like it normally is. Here he does not associate darkness with sadness, with gloom, with death. He is calling it embalmed darkness. It is a darkness which is peaceful. It is a darkness which pacifies senses, which gives peace, which embalms, which takes away pain. A balm, you know, We apply balm when we have a pain in the bones or in the muscles. So he's talking about that kind of a feeling, where the darkness has a soothing effect on his senses and on his emotions. Guess, he says, but in embalmed darkness, guess each sweet wherewith the seasonable month endows the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree. He says, I can guess. I can guess through the sweet smell that has filled up this place in this seasonable month. It is the month of summer, where all the flowers are blooming, and he says even the grass is giving off its soft scent and perfume. Even the thicket is, and the fruit trees, wild fruit trees, are growing nearby. So he says, I can understand from the smell that there is that I'm surrounded with thick grass, that I'm surrounded with the thicket, the small bushes, and there are fruit trees, wild fruit trees around me. White hawthorn and the pastoral eglantine, fast fading violets covered up in leaves, and mid-May's eldest child, the coming musk rose full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. The words that I have highlighted here are the names of plants, the names of flowers. So he is in these lines he gives you a lot of names. He gives you a lot of names of plants, but he tells you that he can't see them. He can't see these plants, but through the sweet smell or perfume reaching his nose, he can understand what they are. He says, I can smell the white hawthorn growing nearby, and there is the pastoral eglantine also. The eglantine tree, which grows in the pastoral regions, in the valleys, in the green valleys. He says, there are violets which are short-lived. They fade quickly, covered up in leaves, and mid-May's eldest child. This is another flower. The coming musk rose, then he can smell musk rose, he says, which is full of dewy wine. The musk, the rose, we also draw nectar from it, the wine from it. So he's talking about that. It is as the wine from the rose is as intoxicating as any other wine. And then he talks about the sense of hearing in the last line. He says, a murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. He says, I can also hear, because there are so many flowers blooming around me, I can also hear the murmurous sound of the flies in the summer evenings. So in stanza 5, he employed his senses of sight mostly, not sight, he employed his sense of smell, and he explained to you what was this kind of night, what was this kind of world in which this nightingale lives. So what do you understand from that description? He tells you that the world, the place where the nightingale is, and the place from where it sings those beautiful songs, is surrounded by those beautiful flowers. This is a beautiful world of wonderful flowers, and of beautiful and scent, a beautiful scent. He says that which all these combined have a very soothing effect. So the nightingale lives in a world of beauty. It lives in a world of peace. It lives in a world of tranquility, and it lives away from the natural, away from the material and the human world. It lives in the thick of the bushes, hidden from view. So its world is far, far away from the world of man, from the world of humans. And it is a world which is surrounded by beautiful flowers. So he creates for you a picture of a world that is peaceful at the same time. It is beautiful. In stanza 6, now he talks about the sense of hearing. He says, darkling I listen. He told you that this was the evening time, and he could hear the bird singing, and it was night, because he described to you how the queen moon was shining above in the center of the sky. So the darkness is approaching. He says, but I still listen to the bird. And for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many amused rhymes, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now he becomes serious, he becomes sober. Now his senses, which were dull in the beginning, before he had entered the world of the nightingale, now seem to clear up. He can think a little clearly. He's out of that state of confusion and dumbness that he was in. He is thinking clearly and carefully now. He says, as I am in the world of the nightingale, and I can still hear the bird singing, it has caused a strange effect. The world coupled with the song of the nightingale have had a strange effect on the poet. He says he's now thinking of death. The thought of death enters his mind. So Keats cannot separate or forget the idea of death, and he can't separate it from life. He can't separate it from hope. So even when he is in the tranquil world of nightingale, and he feels lightened, he feels relaxed, he feels peaceful, he still thinks about death. He says, for a long time I've thought about death. But here he's not even like the darkness was embalmed for him. It was not scary. Here death is also not scary. It is easeful death. But so the change in him is that now that he's in the world of nightingale and he thinks of death, he is not scared of death. He is not full of pain at the thought of death. He calls it easeful death. He sees it as something that will take away his pain and that will unburden him, that will make him relaxed and peaceful and light. He says, I have called him sweet names, soft names, in many amused rhymes. His amused rhymes are his poems. He says, in many of my poems, I have called him with soft names. I have talked about it. But now he says that I can breathe easily now. I am no more afraid of death. I can look into death with a serene mind now, as I listen to the song of the nightingale. So it is the effect of the song of the nightingale, and it is the peaceful effect of this world of nightingale. And then he says, now more than ever seems it rich to die, to seize upon midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. Now he is longing to die. We saw in the ode on aggression and how he's afraid of death, how he's eulogizing, how he's admiring the world of the urn because it is immortal, because death will never touch it. But here we see that he's feeling the opposite. He's no more afraid of death. He's no more scared of it. He says, now more than ever it seems that it is rich to die. Now it is important because it is this present state of mind only. When he is in that imaginary beautiful world of nightingale and he can listen to the beautiful song, he is so lost from all that had ever bothered him in his own world or in his own life, that he says even death seems like a pleasant thought to him. It is rich to die, he says, to seize upon the midnight with no pain. Because there is no pain in him, no pain, no fear of death, and he feels completely relaxed now, and he's under that tranquil effect of the song of the bird, that all pain, all worries, all tensions have been taken away from him. And as he says, I am listening to the bird, I feel that I can die. I can die peacefully, and I can die happily, and I can die in an ecstasy. Now, ecstasy is a special word with poets, with romantic poets, especially with Keats, you must have noticed. It is, he uses it whenever he's talking about an extreme feeling of joy, when he's talking about an unbounded joy, when he's talking about joy and happiness that is too much to contain, when he's talking about joy and happiness that is unimaginable. So ecstasy, he's talking about extreme sense of happiness, extreme delight, extreme joy. So he is in that state. He says, I'm in that elated state that I can die right now on this spot with no pain and with no worries, with no fear of death, with no fear of life after death. He says, but I want to die while listening to the song of the bird. And then he says, still wouldest thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sword. Now he gives it a thought, gives his idea a thought, and the only pain that he feels is that he would no longer be able to listen to the song of the nightingale. He is not worried about any of his friends or his beloved or anything or anyone from his life. He is not worried to leave behind anything. He is not worried even about the life after death. All that he is worried about is that after he dies, he will not be able to listen to the song of the nightingale. The nightingale will also become, will also stop singing for him, because he will be in a world where the song of the nightingale may not reach him. So he asks this question, he says, still wouldest thou sing, and I have ears in vain? I have ears in vain means that although he says, I will have my physical form and I will have my ears, but they will not be able to listen, they will not be able to hear the song of the nightingale. Yes, even when I cannot hear you, I cannot listen to you, will you still go on singing? So you see, he puts a question to the nightingale. So the only worry, the only pain that he has is that if he dies, if he chooses to die now on this spot, he says, the song of the nightingale will not reach him. To thy high requiem become a sword. Requiem is the last song, is a song for the dead, and a sword is the it's a grassy soil on the mound or on his grave. He says, I would have become like a piece of earth, piece of grassy soil. When I would be lying under the earth, when I would be lying in my grave, will you sing the last song for me? Will you sing the song for me? So he is putting that question to the bird of the nightingale. So he will miss the song of the nightingale even when he dies. Then in stanza 7, he says, thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. Now this is important because here he is going to give it an eternal status. The bird now becomes a symbol of immortality. It always was with Keats from the beginning, maybe. We felt it, but it is here that he spells it out. It is here that he explains it in his own words. It is here that he eventually gives it shape for you. So he calls it immortal. Remember in the previous stanza, in the stanza 6 that I just discussed with you, he was talking about death, and he said that death is, he's not afraid of death anymore. That is not a fearful thing for him anymore. He says that he's ready to die while listening to the song of the nightingale, but he says his only fear is that when he'll die, the song of the nightingale will no longer reach him. So in that stanza, he was sort of dividing his world, his new world, where he'll go after he dies, from the nightingale, from the world of the nightingale. But here you shall see, by giving the bird the immortal status. By calling it an immortal bird, he's going to take the nightingale along with him to that world also. He's going to unite the world of the nightingale to all the worlds, to this material world of ours, and to that other world also where the poet will be after he dies. So he says that thou was not born for death. He says, I may die, all human race may die, but O bird, you will not die. But we know, and you know, that birds do die. They also have experienced cyclical death. It is also part of nature. They are not immortal. So why is it that Keats is calling nightingale immortal? Why does he call him an immortal bird? And you see that he's written bird with a capital B. He's made it a symbol of immortality, but at the same time he's personified the bird also. He's personified it as some kind of a spirit. It is a spirit that never dies. It is a spirit that has been there since generations, that has been there since the beginning of the world and will be there till the end of the world. So it is an immortal bird. It is an immortal spirit. So gradually Keats is giving it the status that he had in his mind, but he is now describing it to you. He says, no hungry generations tread thee down. No hungry generations tread thee down. The hungry generations, he's referring to us, the humans, like when we become old, our children are ready to replace us. So he's calling that generation, the hungry generation, who are waiting for the older ones to go and for them to replace them and to take up their positions. So he says, you are not haunted by that fear. You are not depressed because you don't have those kinds of fears like we humans have, that we have the next generation longing and waiting and hoping for us to die so that they can one day replace us and take all that is now with us. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. So now he takes you back in time. He says, this song of the nightingale, why is it immortal? Why is it immortal? One reason he gave you is because he says, no hungry generations are waiting to replace you. Although we know that it's not true. The nightingale is followed by the young ones, and then they are followed by their young ones. So the cycle continues. But he is referring to the song of the nightingale and the beauty of that song and how it has been retained in art, in literature, through centuries. Nightingale has been a popular bird with the poets and with the writers over centuries. And I think I did mention it to you when we discussed it with reference to Wordsworth's poem. And I told you then how in Greek myths and then in the Roman world, nightingale was a symbol of, was an important symbol. So the nightingale has, that is how it has survived generations. That is how it is immortal, because it has become part of poetry. It has become part of the writings. It has become part of literature, and we hear about the beauty of its song. So many generations have been inspired by its song, and they may have died, but the song of the nightingale have transferred in the form of the written literary works. It has been transferred from one generation to the next, and that has survived. So in that way, the bird has survived. The beauty of the bird has survived. The beauty of the song of the bird has survived. So it says, I heard your voice, he says, the voice that I hear now, he says, I have heard it also in ancient days. It was heard in ancient days by emperors and clowns. He may be here referring to the glorious days of the Romans. But we can take it further back, and he may be speaking of the Greeks, because remember he was so fond of the Greek golden period. He says the Greeks and the Romans also honored the word in their poetries, and because their poetry was mostly composed for quotes, so it was often recited in quotes, he says. So the bird is immortal because the song has held in trance generations since old time. So he says the same song had inspired people, emperors and clowns, he says, in the old times again. And then he says, perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth, when sick for home she stood in tears amid the alien corn. Now he takes you to another scene. He takes you to another chapter in history, and this time he's talking about the story of Ruth. And this story of Ruth occurs in the Hebrew Bible, or which is called the Old Testament. And there is a whole chapter in that book by the title, The Book of Ruth. Book of Ruth. And this is a story of Ruth in the Bible. This is a sad story. So you see how he's mingling sadness also with the song, how it touches the heart. So the story of Ruth is sad. Let me first explain to you. It is written here. I'll read it out, the story of Ruth, and then I'll explain. In the Bible, the story of Ruth is explained, and very briefly, the story, according to the story, Ruth married a guy, and she moved to a new country with her husband, naturally, and her husband died, leaving her all alone in that alien foreign country. And since she loved her husband a lot, she decided not to leave his world, not to leave his country, not to leave his home, and she stayed there, and she looked after his mother, who was old, and she worked ceaselessly and in the strange fields, and she saw many tough times. She had to work in strange climates, but she worked hard and looked after his mother, and she proved his love for him. And it was during those tiring working hours that she would sometimes sing the song. So this is what the poet is referring to here. Later on, there is some happy ending. She later on remarries, and there is a change of fate, a change of fortunes. But the poet says here that maybe this Ruth, as she worked in the fields, she too was inspired by the song of the nightingale. She too sought inspiration from the song of the nightingale. Maybe her sadness also evaporated when she listened to the song of the nightingale. So she even found tranquility, she even found peace, she may even have found strength from the song of the nightingale. So the poet is connecting the story of Ruth, which is a biblical story, to the song of the nightingale. And he suggests that the song of the nightingale may even have a role to play in giving strength and tranquility and peace and happiness to Ruth, who was sad in the alien fields and worked all by herself there. And even when she was sick for home, he tells us, she did not leave that plain, but she stood in tears amid the alien corn, and she sang. And maybe she was inspired by the song of the nightingale. And then he takes you to another world, and he says, the same that oft times hath charmed magic casements, opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. Now he takes you to another world altogether. He takes you to deep oceans. He takes you to the deep seas, and he says he wants you to imagine a huge, old, ghostly ship, maybe like the ship, the kind of ship that you studied in Ancient Mariner. He wants you to imagine and to go to that, be at that ship. And imagine a huge charmed magic casement. It's a huge charmed magic box he says on those dangerous scenes when they open with beautiful musical sounds, and it carries some magical powers or magical properties. He says, so the fairy lands here may be a reference to some foreign lands, but what he's trying to say is that the Song of the Nightingale has influenced everyone who's ever listened to it, and it gave them courage and hope in their adversity and troubles. So this song, this nightingale, he says, the song was heard by the emperors in the past. It was heard, he says, by Ruth as she stood alone working in the fields. It is heard, he says, in the oceans deep, in the perilous seas, he says, in the dangerous seas. And the song, he says, can be heard in the music that is heard when some magical box is open. So it's a ghostly ship, and it's a magical ship. It carries a ghostly, charmed magical box. When you open it, it opens with a musical sound, and he's comparing that musical sound to the Song of the Nightingale. And he says it has properties of charming, of creating some magical effect on the listeners. So it is this kind of eternity, it is this kind of immortality that he is bestowing upon this bird. So the bird has become a symbol of immortality for him because it has survived, because its story, its song, the effect of its song has survived generations. It has been transferred through generations. It has survived in the works of literature, and it has been passed down from generations to generations. And it's not like the humans, where one generation completely overthrows the other, or the previous generation, or the older generation, and makes their own mark and forgets their ways. So he says, but this Song of Nightingale and this tradition of seeking inspiration from Nightingale, he says, that has always been there, and it is there even now. So this tradition of seeking inspiration from the beautiful Song of the Nightingale, seeking strength, seeking hope, seeking courage in times of troubles and adversity, this, he says, is not a strange and uncommon phenomenon. This, he says, has happened in the past too, and it is happening now also, and it will happen in the future also, and it will happen in this world or in the other world. So he says the world of the Nightingale is for all worlds, and the Song of the Nightingale is for all times. And this is how it is timeless, this is how it is immortal, and this is how it is powerful. Then stanza 8, the last stanza of the poem, you shall see that he is shaken. He's shaken out of this world. He's shaken out of this reverie. He's shaken out of this fancy. He comes back to the real world, but he comes back dejected. He comes back forlorn. He comes back disappointed, because he doesn't want to return. He says forlorn. Forlorn is a word when we are now alone, we are abandoned. In fact, abandoned is a better explanation, because it describes to us the sense of someone having left us, someone having left us in the middle, abandoned us. He says forlorn, I am abandoned. The bird has abandoned me. Actually, the song of this nightingale stopped. Keats was transported into that imaginary world. He was transported, he was taken into the world of the nightingale, because he could hear the song, he could listen to the song of the nightingale. As long as the bird was singing, he was in that other world. And just when the bird stopped singing, he came back to reality. He came back to his real world. So this is why he says forlorn, because he has been forced to return to this world. The bird has stopped singing from wherever it was singing, It has now stopped singing, and the poet has been shaken back to the reality. And the reality is crude to him, because what he was thinking and imagining was all unreal. He now realizes. So he's back to his senses. He says, the very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul's self. So he feels abandoned, he says. This word, he says, even this, the word of the sense of abandonment, the feeling of abandonment, he says, it is cruel. It has a cruel, painful effect on me. Adieu. Adieu is farewell. When we say goodbye, he says goodbye, farewell, O nightingale. He bids it farewell. Then he says, the fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. Now the fancy here is personified, and it is personified as a deceiving elf. He calls fancy or imagination. This is important here. Unlike Coleridge, Keats does not differentiate between fancy and imagination. He uses both the words for the same thing. Coleridge, if you remember, distinguished between fancy and imagination. He differentiated between the two, and I explained it to you when we discussed Coleridge, but Keats does not. So he says, adieu, the fancy or my imagination, he says, has not been successful. It has not been able to keep me for long in that imaginary world. This is why he calls it deceiving elf. He says, our imagination or our fancy, it transports us into an imaginary world. It takes us to its world, and we become part of that world. We feel that we are safe in that world, but he says, no, it is just a deceit. It is the fancy is like an elf. An elf is a fairy creature. He says it deceives, because we're not safe there, we're not there for a long time. It always sends us back. He says it because he's unable to escape permanently into the world of the nightingale, because he cannot stay in that world for a long time. So now he's calling imagination as a deceiving elf. But remember, he was so great a fan of this capacity of imagination, because it was this capacity of imagination or fancy that in fact makes him forget the worries of this world. But here, because he's at the moment dejected and disappointed, he's calling it by these names. He says, adieu, adieu, farewell, farewell, goodbye, goodbye, thy plaintive anthem fades, past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. The song had stopped. He was shaken back into reality. He is dejected because his stay in the imaginary world has ended. But now he says he can hear the singing of the bird again. He calls it the plaintive anthem. So the plaintive, he can still hear the sad song of the bird, but it is fading. It is going further and further away. The bird is maybe shifting its position in the trees. It is shifting its position in the bushes and the thickets. It's not at one place now. So it is moving in the thick forest, and it is moving further away from the poet. This is why the poet says that your song is fading. It is going thinner and thinner, and it is fading from my ears. The sound is fading. He says, sometimes I hear you near the meadows, sometimes near the stream, up the hillside. Now you are up the hillside, and now you are buried deep in the next, and now he says you are in the next valley, buried deep in the next valley glades. So the songs seem to be coming from different directions, and he says that he says goodbye to her, because he knows that the song will no longer be able to have the same effect on him. And then comes, like Ode on Grecian, two strange lines. Ode on Grecian ended on those two philosophical lines which later on were to become so problematic for the critics. These lines too also offer a lot of problem to the critics, and they are also strange, because Keats, who had so it's up till now seemed to have composed his poem in a natural manner, in these two lines he seemed to somehow appear discordant, appear different from the rest of the poem. He says, was it a vision or a waking dream? He's even doubting that he experienced anything. He's doubting everything now. Although just a few lines above, he told us how imagination or fancy had taken us into that imaginary world. But now he says, was it a vision or a waking dream? He says, did I see a vision? Or did I see a dream as I was awake? He says, was it actually real? Was it actually so real that it was a vision, that I actually saw it? So, but all that thing had so much effect on him that he feels that it was real, but now he can't decide. He says, was it a vision or a waking dream? Or I was just daydreaming that I heard the song and I was transported into that world. So even the song of the nightingale, or even the bird nightingale, that has become a dream now, that has become a vision now for him. Fled is that music, and the reason is because the music is now gone. It was under the trance of music, it was the music that had transported him, and it had caused him that vision or that dream. So now that the song is gone, he doubts everything. He doubts whether the vision was real, whether the dream was whether he actually saw a dream. And then he asks and further confuses us. He says, do I wake or sleep? So am I awake or sleep? He even doubts his own senses now. He even doubts his own senses. He says, am I awake or am I still sleeping? Is this all a dream that I see, or have I really come back to reality? So he cannot decide. So these are once again problematic lines, because at one time they show to us that Keats cannot decide whether he actually entered the world of the nightingale, because he calls it a vision or a waking dream. So either it was all a dream for him and he's waken up from that dream and it was so unreal, or at the other time he says, when he says in the last part, do I wake or sleep, it means that he cannot decide. He cannot decide that he's come out of that world. Is he still part of that world? So he is in a state of confusion. These lines may even depict his longing to be part of that world, because he doesn't want to leave that world, because he still wants to stay in that world. He's talking like this. He does not want to wake up to reality. He does not want to wake up to his real world, of pain and misery. So he is thinking like this. But whatever may be the reasons, these last two lines offer us to think. They make us think on what the poet actually might be feeling. But with this, we come to the end of the poem. And as you must have realized, that there were themes in this poem that were similar to the themes that were explored in Ode on the Grecian Urn. And I think I have now mentioned it on a number of occasions as well. And in fact mentioned those themes to you also. So that should not be a problem now. But let us see now what Keats himself thought about the poem. And what else can we decide about the poem? Now, critics generally agree that Nightingale was the second of the 5 great odes of 1819, and its themes are reflected in its twin ode, Ode on a Grecian. So this is significant, although there is, we cannot be sure whether this is true, but most critics seem to agree that of all the great odes that were published in the year 1819, Ode to a Nightingale was the second ode that he wrote, that he composed, after Ode on a Grecian. So they are called twin odes because they were published one after the other, and also because they share same themes. Similar themes are reflected in both the poems, and the similar desire of the poet to escape into the imaginary world is described here, described in both the poems. Keats's friend and roommate Charles Brown described the composition of the beautiful work as follows. And again, there are doubts to this account also, but it is nonetheless harmless if you're aware of it, because most of the poems that Keats has written are inspired from direct experience. So we can also assume that this poem was also inspired by his direct experience with the Song of the Nightingale. So this friend of Keats, Charles Brown, he says, in the spring of 1819, a nightingale had built her nest near my house. Keats felt a tranquil and continual joy in her song. And one morning, he took his chair from the breakfast table to the grass plot under a plum tree where he sat for 2 or 3 hours. When he came into the house, I perceived he had some scraps of paper in his hand, and these he was quietly thrusting behind the books. On inquiry, I found these scraps, 4 or 5 in number, contained his poetic feeling on the song of our nightingale. The writing was not well legible, and it was difficult to arrange the stanzas on so many scraps. With his assistance, I succeeded, and this was his Ode to a Nightingale, a poem which has been the delight of everyone. This is Charles Brown describing how Keats actually composed the poem and showing to us how this is composed under a direct influence, when the Song of the Nightingale actually did inspire the poet, and in 2 to 3 hours he composed the poem. And when he came back, they were able to transcribe or arrange the poem. So a poem which is a result of direct experience of the poet himself. Let's look at some of the themes that emerge from the poem. You shall see that most of them, as I've repeatedly now told you, are similar to the themes of the other ode, the Ode on a Grecian. Now we saw here that there are 3 main thoughts. There are 3 main thoughts that stand out in this ode. One is Keats's own evaluation of life, which is filled with pain and tears. And this was, I think, in stanza 3, where he talks about how life is full of misery and pain, how life is mortal, how life always lives in the fear of death, how beauty here is temporary, how youth here is fading, how love here is transient, it is fickle. So he describes to us how things here are painful, how things here have no beauty, have no charm, and that is why humans have no peace, they have no happiness, and that is why they have this desire to escape into an imaginary world where they find those things. So at one level, the poem offers us that evaluation, that impression of life that Keats have, and we see that Keats is not satisfied with his life, he is not satisfied with what we call life, he is not happy with what we call life. And we know that in his own life he had seen miseries most of the time, he had seen troubles and pains, so he shows it through his poems, and he's constantly wishing that he might die, and he wishes to enter into a pain-free world, And this is, as we have seen, a recurrent attitude towards life. The feeling, the desire to die, the desire to enter into a world which is free of pain, the world which is immortal. This is a continuous theme with the poet. And then we see that there is a power of, the role of power of imagination or fancy. It is through imagination, through the powerful imagination or fancy, he is able to enter into the world. He's able to enter into the world of the Eng. He's able to enter into the world of the nightingale. So he takes help from imagination. But in this poem, an important thought is added, and that is that imagination or fancy, whatever it is, Keats tells us, is not powerful at all. Is not powerful after all. He says it cannot give more than temporary escape from the cares of life, from the troubles of life, from the problems of life. So he says even the world of imagination or fancy, it is deceiving because it offers only a temporary escape. It is not a permanent escape. And this was why also in Ode on Aggression, and also he described the world, or he described the Eng as pastoral, cold pastoral. He described it as cold pastoral. So there are these conflicts that we find in both the poems of Keats. His desire to enter into the world of imagination and his tribute that he pays to this world of imagination, or the quality of imagination, because it is that quality of poet that elevates his thoughts. But at the same time we see Keats is aware of its harmful and destructive effects. Keats is aware of its temporariness, although he talks about the imaginary world as being immortal and timeless and forever and everlasting, but at the back of his mind he is aware that it is temporary. He's aware that it is as temporary and fickle as our world here. So we find this contradiction. We find this thought surfacing in his poems at different points, but we have to be very vigilant. We have to be very thoughtful in order to understand it, and in order to capture it when he talks about it. Here in this poem, in Ode on a Nightingale, he talks about it openly. He calls it a deceiving elf. So with this, we come to the end of the poem. We saw how both the odes share similar attitudes of the poet, how both the odes share similar ideas and concepts of the poet, how they have similar themes, and how both the ideas offer a philosophical truth, and how both the ideas also, or how both the poems also throw light on the contradictions or on the conflicts in Keats's own mind or Keats's own poetry. And we must not forget that both of these odes are highly famous odes of Keats, and they are greatly applauded by critics. And there are lines from these poems that are oft quoted and oft remembered. So you must also take pain to quote and memorize the lines from both the poems. And you must remember that it is important that you understand the main idea or the main thought or the main message that the poet has in mind when he's talking about with either the Eng or the nightingale. It is after his description, after the analysis of the poems, the message that is more important. As with the Ode on Aggression, and we saw that the message was beauty is truth and truth beauty, because he tells you that is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. So he discards any other thought from his mind. But the message was also cold pastoral. The message was also, as he calls it, the bride of silence. So he talks about different ideas, different themes, and an understanding of those ideas and themes is important. The explanation of the poems is not difficult, but it is the conceptual basis, the philosophical ideas that require your understanding. So you need to be clear about what he's trying to achieve here. What is the message? Although he's not a moralist, but he does want to convey something. So what is that which he wants to convey? So there are conflicts in his poems that you need to be aware of, that you need to understand. He does give an immortal status to the imaginary world. He calls our world the temporary world, but then that also sometimes becomes contradictory, as he tells you in Ode to a Nightingale, how that imaginary world can also be temporary, how that imaginary world can also be fickle, because he has to come back. So where in Ode on a Grecian, when he compares the temporary world to the immortal world and is lost in the bliss and the happy state of the world of the urn, he only tells us that the beauty, the truth is beauty. He says, because that world appears to be the true world, it is truth, so it is also beautiful. And because beauty cannot be ugly, so if it is a beautiful world, it must also be a true world. So, but here he says that the world of the nightingale is true. It is the world of the nightingale is beautiful. It is pain-free. It is a happy world. But he says it is also temporary. So this is the misery of man that he is talking about. This is his deep gloominess, or this is deep pessimism or pessimistic approach to life, that the escape even that he seeks is not temporary, it is not lasting. So there are some contradictions in his work also that you need to be aware of and that you need to pay attention to when you discuss or analyze his major themes. So with this we come to the end of the lecture. In the next lecture I will look up and discuss one other poem by Keats, and that is Ode to Melancholy. We will analyze that poem also, and then we will take up another poet in the lecture after that. So I take leave now, and I will see you again in the next lecture. Thank you.